Welcome to Study Isaiah, the podcast where we examine the language, historical context, and meaning of the book of Isaiah with Dr. Paul Wegner. I'm Tyler Sanders, and across from me is Dr. Wegner, who's going to tell us the Hebrew word of the day.
And are you ready for this? It's the name Isaiah.
That's a good one to handle early in this podcast.
Yeah. It's Yahoo, actually, at the end. And just like a lot of names that have a divine name in it, like Daniel has the name El at the end, or Jeremiah has the name Yahweh at the end. So Isaiah has the name Yahweh at the end, although it's a shortened form.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I didn't tell you what it means.
Yeah,
though.
let's get the whole meaning. Yeah, let's add the two things together. We have Yahweh, that's part of it.
Okay.
The second part, right?
Well, actually, yeah. And the first part is saves or salvation. Names are hard to know whether they're verbs or like nouns. So most people say it's Yahweh is salvation or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, Yahweh is a very fascinating word.
It is.
In Hebrew. And I would love for you to walk us through some of those interesting pieces of it.
Okay, can we go through all the names for God?
Let's do that. Let's go back even further. I like that, yeah.
Okay, I tried to think what different names for God would you guys be familiar with? And one would be El, which is a name for God, and it's more of a general term. And you see that like in Emmanuel, the name in Isaiah 7. It's got Imman with us. Immanu is the with us, and then El, so it's God is with us.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's El. Then the more common one is Elohim, which is a plural ending on that noun, and commonly said to be a plural of majesty, or a majestic plural, or a plural of honor, or something like that. It's usually called that. And that makes sense, I think. The next name would be the Lord, and that's one, you'll see it commonly in your translation as capital L and then capital O-R-D, but those O-R-D are going to be smaller letters. That's become the conventional way to do Yahweh, and so that's actually what it is. But Yahweh is a unique word, and we want to get into it in a minute, but I need to tell you two more words. One is Lord, and that would be capital L, small o, small r, and small d, and that's actually another name for God sometimes, and it's more like master or Lord. Okay, but it's another name for it. It's separate from Yahweh.
So is it more of a generic term that kind of is ascribed, or is it something that becomes a proper noun?
It's probably more of a general name, but it's that one is always used for God.
Okay.
Okay, and then there's one more, my Lord. That's usually a human Lord or master or something like that. Sarah calls Abraham her Lord, or her husband, in Genesis 18:12.
Yeah.
So that one is more of a that's your general term, and it actually has a suffix on it, my Lord. Oh, I didn't tell you, the one right above that actually has a plural suffix on it. So it's matching like the name Elohim, only it's Lord. Another one would be like majestic plural kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right, now let's get into the one that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Usually the word Lord, and remember we talked about it being capital letters, only the O-R-D are going to be smaller than the first L.
And this is pretty common in English translations.
Yeah, and you'll see it.
They're working to tell us
Yep.
often which Hebrew word referring to God is
and I'd
being
actually
used,
even argue that the specific name that's used for God is usually there for a reason. It's either highlighting a characteristic of God or something like that. So the different names are just fascinating for God, and I think it's really important that we know what they are. Elohim is usually the more general name for this all-powerful God. Yahweh is the personal name for God. In Exodus chapter 6, it talks about, I'm going to make my self known as Yahweh to them. And then later he makes a covenant with Abraham. And so it's his personal name that he's making known to him.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is we have no idea what the vowel pointings are And so what's happened, and I made this a PowerPoint because otherwise there'd be no way you'd know this, right? But at the top there is how you usually see it in a Hebrew text pointed. So what I've done is the 4 consonants from Yahweh are basically what we know God revealed. I don't know if you remember, but in the when the first texts were written, they didn't have vowel points.
Right.
Those didn't come around till like 500 to 800 A.D. So these are unpointed texts. So what happened is, as far as we can tell, the Jewish people did not want to blaspheme and by saying God's name. So what they did is every time they got to that tetragrammaton, we call it, the 4 letters, they actually put the vowel pointings for the Lord onto it. So every time you see that name Yahweh, they actually are pronouncing the name Lord, the Lord. And so it's interesting. So I don't know if you can tell, but here's my word Adonai over here, and it's taken the vowel points off and put on the 4 consonants from Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And so that's actually where you got the name Jehovah. If you take the yod in German, the yod is a J. Mm-hmm. Then you have a schwa, which would be like an E. Then you have an H. Then you have an O from the holem there. Mm-hmm. Then you have actually in Hebrew, the holem wow is one letter. It's a vowel. Right. But what they've done is they've actually pronounced the holem, the wow, and the comets underneath it as 3 different letters. Right. Even though they're not. Okay. Right. And then there's a hey at the end. Yeah. So we actually know that Jehovah is not the real name for God. Right. So the Jehovah's Witness are actually wrong. But instead, so what that is, it's a made up name, so that every time they got to the tetragrammaton, they would say the Lord rather than what his real name was. So in actual fact, we really don't know how to pronounce his name. Yeah.
They're getting to it, and when they're reading it in Hebrew, they're seeing the consonants for Yahweh.
Yes.
But the vowels for Adonai, essentially. Yeah. And that kind of clues them in. Say this, Adonai.
Yes. Yep.
So that you don't accidentally blaspheme.
This is called a perpetual chore. They're always pronounced this way. Okay. But in actual fact, there are other ones that, like some, they do this commonly in the well, I wouldn't say commonly, but they do it regularly in the Hebrew text. If they want you to pronounce, you see what the consonants are, but they want you to say something else. They'll put the vowel points of the other word on there, and that does happen other places. So it's not like this is unique. It does happen other places.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And so when this fits into Isaiah, how exactly is that working? Is it using a shorter version of Yahweh?
Yes, it is. In fact, names can actually do that, and quite often. So if you look at sometimes the shortest name, like Isaiah, is really only pronouncing the yod and then an a vowel and then the hey. But I think you saw earlier, his name is Yahu at the end. So in actual fact, it has a shurik at the end, or a U vowel, even though that's like the next shortest way to say it. And then so you've got it just the first 2 letters, then you've got it with the wow or the vav on there, and then you can say the whole name Yahweh. Okay. So it's interesting. A lot of times the names do have the Yahoo on it, even though most of the time we don't pronounce it.
Yeah, we just pronounce it. I don't know if that's a hard H, but we end it on an H.
Yeah, and we were talking about this. I'm not exactly sure why we don't pronounce the U on the end. You know, Isaiah, Yahu. We could have done it, but we usually don't.
For some reason.
Yeah. And I've seen that. I've seen those shortened forms on coins too. They just have where God's name is there, it just has 1 or 2 of the letters. Huh. Yeah, usually 2, not 1. Yeah.
And it just kind of clues people in. This is what we're saying, essentially.
Yeah, they know that a yod hey means Yahweh.
Yeah. Okay.
It's an abbreviation for it.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's our names for today.
That's good. That's a great. Let's do it one more time.
Okay.
Let's pronounce the word of the day, Isaiah, in Hebrew one more time.
Okay, let's go back to it.
Get it. Yeah.
All right. So it's Yasha Yahu.
Yasha Yahu.
Yeah. And then now we would say it Isaiah without the U on the end.
and
Yeah.
it is Yahweh
Yeah.
is salvation,
Yeah.
or potentially Yahweh saves.
It could be that
verb
too. Yeah.
version.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that his name is important to the context of the text, right? Because in actual fact, God does save. It's going to take a lot longer. You remember we talked about last week about, I think the theme of the book is, will Israel ever obey? And I think the
Right.
answer is yes, but it's going to be a lot longer time down the road, and it's going to be a lot fewer. It's not going to be the whole nation.
Yeah,
It'll be a remnant from them.
A remnant, right.
So it does fit the book really well.
Well, that's good. And I think that will help us get into our next segment where
Yeah.
we start to discuss, before we get into the actual meat of the text a little bit, we're going to get into literary techniques that we're going to be
Okay.
seeing used a lot. So I think the first one you have for us is parallelism, or actually you call it Hebrew parallelism.
This is all over the book. Not every place, because there are narrative sections, but Isaiah mostly is like a semi-poetic format. So you'll see a lot of Hebrew parallelism. And usually you can tell it by, there's two units, and usually the second unit will say almost the same thing as the first one does. Look at that first one. An ox knows its owner, a donkey his master's manger.
Right.
See, okay, so you got different animals, but they're basically saying the same thing.
Yeah, they're relating the same way.
Yeah. The other one, Israel, the next one. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. See, there it's real clear. Israel is my people, and they don't know, they don't understand. Now, each one of those words have slight different connotations, but it's really trying to get at that these are saying the same thing basically in two different phrases. And sometimes, like at the bottom one, I've got three phrases there where it does. So you usually have two, but sometimes you will have a third one that also says the same thing. And so that's what we've got in. I wanted to make sure you could see that they do a variety of them. So most of them were, as you could tell, 2 units, but that last one was a third. And you can see they have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. Yeah. So every one of them's basically saying the same thing.
And in this way, this repetition, these parallel thoughts, is this to kind of hammer in a point, to emphasize a point more?
It probably is. I mean, I'm sure Hebrew parallelism was. I mean, think about this. This is going to have to take a writer some time to consider how you're going to say it, and how you're going to, the second unit, how you're going to advance it or something. And usually, I mean, there's two different kinds of thoughts on this. One is that A and equals B. So the first
unit
thought
and second thought
equals and there is some, they call it synonymous parallelism, and that happens in the biblical text sometimes.
Yeah.
But almost all of the time, when you use a different word, it's going to have different connotations. So it's either going to highlight a different element or take it a little deeper than the first one. So the second way that people have tried to explain parallelism is A and what's more B. So it's the first unit, and then the second unit takes it a little further. Yeah. Like these ones, I'm not sure would do that. But look at verse 4. Alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity. So that weighed down with iniquity is probably highlighting a little more emphasis on what's happening to them.
Or maybe illustrating.
Yeah.
Kind of giving you how.
Yeah.
How
so so you can see that sometimes. So that's why people have said A and what's more B. So it advances that idea just a little further.
It may even work for the second one, really.
Yeah.
Because
they don't know, they do not understand. Understands a little different connotation of than just knowing something.
Yeah.
And the problem with Hebrew is that all these words have a range of meaning. So almost it's very rare that you ever get two words that totally overlap in meaning.
Yeah.
So every time you use a different word, it is going to highlight a little different characteristic or modify it to some extent.
And this seems pretty easy for an English reader,
Yeah.
Reading the Bible to pick up on. Are there any other ways that people or any techniques people can use to try to look for these and make sure they find them?
You know what? Often a good Bible translation will put the lines in a certain way so that, like narrative will just just keep running on the lines. Poetry, usually they try to highlight the balance in them. So right when you read your English translation, you'll see right away that the author, whoever, or the publisher, whoever they were that put those connotations in there, were trying to help you see what they were doing.
Yeah.
So that is, I think that's your easiest way. Just go to a good
they're
Bible
set
translation that
together.
will highlight that.
Yeah.
But I think then the next way is just be aware of it. I mean, because if you practice this a little, it'll actually really help you. I'm teaching Psalms at my church, and it really does help them to understand, they've said something again, but now that's said in a slightly different way, but it's still trying to tell you the same idea. And so I think that's really helpful for people. And like I said, every time a different word is used, it probably has different connotations, and so it's getting at a little different meaning to it.
I imagine it would be helpful just for people to know it's purposeful.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, right.
Just so you're not kind of like, man, why do they keep
breaking
saying
this
the
up?
same
Yeah.
thing? Like, why, and that's true. Like, I think a lot of times in English when we write, it is always about compression and condensing.
Yeah.
Perhaps not in poetry, but in this case, this is a purposeful technique to highlight a point, really.
But you said maybe not in poetry, but in actual poetry, isn't that what the core of what poetry is all about?
Yeah.
Trying to pack as much into
That's true. Yeah.
a set number of words as possible, and I think that's what the author's doing. I mean, I'm amazed.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because you couldn't just rattle this off. It would seem like it seems like you'd have to think about, okay, what am I going to say the second one? Now I realize God is guiding him, but he's using the author's words and all that to get that parallel understanding.
And do you think there's a connection to like a spoken tradition, being able to speak it and hear it, making that a little bit more clear?
Yes, I'm convinced that's what it's for, because I mean, usually, a lot of times when we're talking, we don't always catch maybe what the person is saying. If it's said in a slightly different way, the second time the person's going, oh, now I get it. And so maybe that's partially intended for the oral listener to hear those things and maybe get a slightly different nuance the second time that actually helps clarify things. Yeah.
Okay. That's perfect.
All right. So that's Hebrew parallelism.
Yeah. Let's move on to the next one.
And I think, to tell you the truth, you're going to see that regularly in the book. So that's why we put it first, because it's so common in the book.
And probably throughout the Old Testament.
Quite a
in
bit.
Poetic books, at least,
especially
right?
in the prophets, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to our next
All right. The second one is a play on words. And these ones, a lot of times we won't even catch them in English because the word is going to sound alike in Hebrew. But unless you can match it in English, it's going to be pretty hard.
Yeah.
Actually, there's one. Before we do that, there is one place in Genesis 3:15 when he says, she will be called Ish, or she'll be called Isha because she's taken from Ish. So there's a play on that word. What we do in English is we try to say she will be called woman because she's taken from man. So it almost sounds like they're trying to match the Hebrew sounding words with English sounding words.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, a lot of times they don't do that. And this one is an example where it didn't actually, you would never know this if you didn't know what Hebrew sounded like and stuff like that.
Okay.
So in Isaiah 5:7, it says, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel." This is like the climax of the Song of the Vineyard. All right. "And the men of Judah, his delightful plant." See, that's actually poetic Hebrew parallelism too, right? Thus he looked for justice, mishpat, okay? But behold, bloodshed, mishpat. Okay? So the mishpat versus mispuk. So they would have caught that. That would have been enough for them to say, oh, that's a play on words. And so it would have caught their interest.
And opposite somehow, right? Justice and bloodshed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though the words sound alike, they mean totally opposite.
Yeah.
The second bunch are the same way. For righteousness, tzedakah, but behold, a cry of... I'm sorry. So he was looking for righteousness, tzedakah, but behold, a cry of distress, sa'aka. Okay, so I hate to say that because it sounds like I'm swearing or something, but you can tell Sadaka versus Saaka, and once again they would have caught that. That would have been perfect for their ears to say, oh, so it would have had a meaning, and then it would have been a cute little thing that he did to throw it in to just to remind him of it.
Right.
And once again, like you said before, they're totally opposite.
Yeah.
So he looked for righteousness and got a cry of distress.
Yeah, you're really highlighting that.
Yeah.
Even though these sound so similar, there's such different kind of things.
Yeah. So I thought
Has some weight to it when you hear it, I think.
yeah. Amos has a whole bunch of these. He has these puns on word. I often say it's like my father-in-law. He always does a lot of puns, and so I think Amos is very similar to my father-in-law.
Well, that's I was an English major in college, so we looked at a lot of this kind of stuff. But that was like Shakespeare, like crazy. A lot of times it'd be double or triple meanings on words, and it was a way even. There's people who think this at least, that he could be critical perhaps of like whoever's in charge, the ruling party.
Sure.
There's a way you could say it without saying it.
Yeah, and without
people
getting in
would
trouble.
kind of get it. Yeah, but it'd be like, well, it meant something else. You always had a little bit of little space in there, but it was so specific even to that audience that today you read Shakespeare, you wouldn't know. The word meaning has changed, even if we can read it or whatever, it would be so different.
And if you expect Shakespeare could do this kind of thing, imagine what a divine author could do.
Right.
He's going to have these plays in there, and it's going to make a lot of sense, and it'll be cute and wise all at the same time.
Yeah.
So
now, what's the best way for a person reading an English translation? Like, is this something that may pop up in a study Bible? Do you need a commentary maybe to?
Yeah, I think your
find these kind of
commentary
things?
would probably do it. A study Bible may, but usually a study Bible does more like a topic or something like that. It'll remind you of other places where it is or something like that. But I think your commentary would be the best place to get these play on words.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Let's move on to our next one.
So that one's kind of fun.
That's a good one.
Yeah. Similes. Okay. Similes are trying to equate two things with the name like or as.
Right.
Okay.
You're defining the relationship.
Yeah. All right. So here in Isaiah 1:8, the daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. So there's actually three in that one. There's three connections that he's trying to give examples of or making connections to. So that's unusual. You usually don't have that many in a verse. Yeah.
Now, how is this working in Hebrew? What's the clue that we're looking at a simile in the Hebrew?
You would probably have the word like in Hebrew.
Okay.
And so it would, usually it's
It's a pretty straight translation,
preposition
actually.
ka, and so it would be on, each one of those words.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one is Isaiah 1:9. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. Okay, so first of all, that would have really caught them off guard. Later on, he calls them Sodom and Gomorrah. So he gets even specific. Well, that would have been an image from a lot, in Genesis that they would have been aware of. And so when he likens them to Sodom and Gomorrah, now this one doesn't do that, but later on he is going to call them Sodom and Gomorrah. So he's using a simile here, but later on he connects it to them.
Even deeper.
Yeah.
Or more explicitly, maybe.
Yeah. And they caught it. I'm sure they were angry listening to that. They wouldn't think they were like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Of course, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's our simile or example. The connections of likening several things together.
Now, this is probably a giant question I'm about to ask you. That probably has implications even in English as well. But how far do you think you can relate these two items? When you say like daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, how narrow do you think that is in that definition?
In this one, it actually is pretty clear. It's trying to give you an image of what it looks like. And this is one of the verses that helps us to date chapter 1 of Isaiah. When he's saying that the daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, basically what he's saying is that Jerusalem is sticking up and everything else is, well, in actual fact, that's exactly what happened in 701. The Assyrians came in, destroyed all the nation of Judah, and Jerusalem was the only thing spared. So it's sticking up. And actually, I have a picture of Jerusalem, which is on a hill. Especially Zion is on a hill. So that would have fit that picture just perfectly.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so it's that clear. Not all of them are that
Yeah.
explicit, but these
Those three
ones
kinda
seem to
work.
be that explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right,
That's very helpful.
that's that one.
Okay. Now we're getting to a good one.
Okay,
This is a great one.
chiasm. This one, people have heard the term, but usually don't know what it means. So we'll try to explain it. I've got a good example here from Isaiah 7, verses 15 through 16. And usually what happens, you've got A and then B, the second unit, and then B prime, which matches B, and then A prime, which matches A. Okay? And the way it came about is the Greek letter chi begins with a X like, and it may not exactly give you that format, but it's telling you that the two in the middle are matching and the two outside are matching.
Right.
Now, that actually helps on this verse, these two verses quite a bit. First of all, let's look at the inside part. At that time, he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. Okay. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good. Those are clearly
Yeah.
matching.
Yeah.
All right. So that means that A and A prime are matching. And that's the part that you would never
Right.
know. So look
Right.
what it says. He will eat curds and honey. The land of the two kings you dread will be forsaken. So it's actually helping help us understand what's it mean to eat curds and honey. Well, what it means is the land of the two kings you dread will be forsaken. So how is he going to eat curds and honey? Well, in the context, it's talking about, at least I think, it's talking about when Syria and the northern kingdom, Israel, are destroyed, this child will be eating curds and honey. So the land of two kings you dread will be forsaken. That's Syria and Israel. At that time,
Right.
this child who's going to be born in chapter 4, in verse 14, will eat curds and honey.
Right.
So it's helping you to know. And the way I got that actually was because I knew the two inner side, B and
they're
B
clearly,
prime.
clearly related.
Yeah. So
it's
it's
kind
a real
of-
clear chiasm, I think.
And in a way, a chiasm maybe is similar to parallelism.
Okay.
But there's a reversal.
Yeah.
Right? Like you may have more units,
Yep.
but then there's like a whatever order the first units are in, there will be a reversal
Yep.
in the second. So
Yeah.
when I was in seminary, I always thought of it more as like an arc or a V shape. That's
Okay.
kind of how I had it in my mind. Almost
Yeah.
like if you're on a bike going off a ramp, you kind of launch from the ramp and then you land on the other side, the ground, or hopefully
Okay.
you land well.
Yeah,
But
hopefully.
those two things are related.
Yeah.
There's a period where you're kind of moving up in the air and a period where you're coming down.
Okay.
That those are related. And in the middle, there's like a vertex, I guess, or
Okay.
whatever. You hit a high point, and you're right in the very center of this arc, and then you start coming down.
Yeah. Now, as you can see, what I've done is I've tried to show arcing a little with
Yeah.
my arrows there. The
Right.
only problem is your vertex vertex at the top
Yeah.
is actually going to be in the next one, the palistrophe. The chiasm doesn't have anything in between.
centerpiece, right?
Right. So these two are, and a chiasm only has 4 units, where a palistrophe could have many more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it kind of seems like, at least in this example, it's almost like the chiasm is kind of working like a logic problem. Kind of like this thing is related to this other thing.
Yeah, that's good.
This other object is related. You can kind of like figure out how
Yeah.
that relationship works,
Yeah.
Because I think you're right. You wouldn't necessarily connect. He will eat curds and honey
Yeah.
to the land whose two kings you dread, but it's telling us those are connected.
Yeah.
It's a way to tell us those things are connected.
I
That's
think the
fascinating.
author is intentionally doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
that
chiasms are pretty common
yes,
in both Old and New Testament, really, right?
yes, and you'll see them a lot in the Psalms. They're less rare in poetry, or I mean in the prophets, but there are enough that you can spot them, and they're helpful. As you can see here, I think this is actually helping explain something to us.
Yeah. Now, if a person's looking for these, This one is a pretty obvious one because there's like what 6, 7 words
Yeah.
that are repeated. A pretty specific phrase would be easy.
Yeah.
Is that the best way to find it? Is it going to be repeated phrases? Can it be repeated ideas? To find those kind of
it can even be
relations?
grammar. The grammar can even do it, but those are really hard to catch, and I think
bet,
you'd have
yeah.
to catch those in Hebrew.
Yeah.
But it would seem like to me that if you can find units that say the same thing in the middle, then find out if the other two usually they're quite clear. So you'd usually catch them, I think.
And usually, is it the middle ones, the closer to the center, the ones that are going to be that are
Sometimes,
gonna have
but sometimes
similar
your A
phrases?
and A prime are going to be
Those are
almost
the two.
exact.
yeah. Okay.
So, but these are things that my Sunday school class can catch. We've been going through the Psalms, and they seem to be able to pick them out too. So I think that if you're finding that much similarities, now remember, it's different than your Hebrew parallelism because the Hebrew parallelism has the two units right next to each other.
Right.
These are separated by two parallel units too.
Sure. Right.
So,
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's clear, but you got to be looking for them.
Yeah. And they can be several units long too.
Sure.
Like this example is
Oh,
2 units and 2 units essentially.
yeah, and usually I argue that a chiasm is basically going to stick to this. It's going to have your
So
four
it will be
parts.
okay.
Yeah, it's almost always going to be like that. Yeah.
Okay. So it is a little bit more maybe of a narrow definition here. Yeah.
So that you can catch them, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, our next one is I have one between that.
Okay, yeah.
Merism is another thing that I think we need to know about.
Yeah, that was a word I wasn't familiar with.
Yeah, it means to take the extremes, and it means everything in between. So my bottom one, Isaiah 1:2 says, "Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth." I'm assuming that means everybody better be listening. If it's
Right.
everything on the heavens and everything in the earth, then I assume everything should be listening.
Yeah.
The other one is kind of interesting too. So the Lord cuts off head and tail from Israel. So notice the head and the tail.
Yeah.
I think it's thinking about a horse. So you've got the head at the beginning, tail at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. From Israel, both palm branch and bulrush. So palm branch is going to be clear at the very top. Your bulrush is going to be down on the bottom.
Yeah.
So I think it means that he's going to cut off everything from the head to the tail and from the palm branch to the bulrush. So that means everything, I think.
The whole thing.
And then it actually helps clarify it. So in verse 15, it says, "And the head is the elder and honorable man, and the prophet who teaches falsehood is the tail."
It defines them. Yeah.
And I often say, I don't think it means the tail, it's what the tail's connected to.
yeah, right.
But
Yeah.
can you see what he thinks of a prophet
sure.
that's telling the falsehood?
Yeah, right.
Because it's so deceptive.
Yeah.
They think that this guy's speaking for God, and he's
Right.
not.
Right.
And so I can see why he'd be the lowest of the low in God's mind.
Actually, I found another good example.
Yeah?
I thought this one may be on here, but I'm glad I have it in my pocket here.
Yeah.
Isaiah 7:11. I can't really take too much credit for this. I got it in your commentary.
That's all right.
Make it as deep as Sheol
Oh, yeah.
or as high as heaven.
Yeah.
That's a good one because that's so obvious, the extremes you have there. And I think kind of like, heavens and earth, it's like in the, what's
And
not
remember
included in that.
In the context of that passage, he's asking Ahaz to request a sign from him. And he's saying, it can be anything, as high as heaven or as low as Sheol.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's a gracious God, isn't it? That's willing to give him a choice of his sign, and it can be anything.
Right.
So I thought that's amazing.
And so how is this functioning? Is this kind of like an illustrative kind of like, obviously it's more than to bring color into the text, but is it a way to kind of maybe bring something, a very real kind of metaphor to it, something concrete?
Well, like your first one, where God's coming in and cutting off the head and the tail, he's going to wipe out all of Israel. Now, except the remnant, but it's going to be serious punishment that he's got. And so I think that's to remind us, this is going to be a serious punishment that the nation's going to go through.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good one. Merism.
Merism. All right, let's go for the next one. Here's palistrophe.
A palistrophe.
There's more in the biblical text than you think sometimes, and this was the first one I found. So it was, in my mind, this one was one of the clearest ones. But then later I found one in Isaiah 1, and I think I can show you that too.
Okay.
But look at this one. It starts with a song of the vineyard, okay?
Okay. And that's in Isaiah 5.
Yeah.
So
And-
this is part of that subsection, Isaiah 2 through 12,
Yes.
right? That's one of
Yep.
the bigger sections in there. This is a portion of that.
Yep. And
We're going to go from 5 to 12?
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Where once again you've got the third introduction in chapter 13,
Yeah.
so that's a good breaking point. But it starts with a song of the vineyard, and if you remember, it's got that play on the image where he invites the people that are listening to help judge this vineyard. You know, it's the vineyard owner did everything. He put rocks around it for a fence. He took out all the weeds. He built a wine vat in it and got it all ready, or wine press in it.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be sour grapes. So he asked the people, "What should I do with it?"
Yeah.
And I'm sure they're all saying, it doesn't say this, but I'm sure they're all saying, "Well, destroy
Yeah.
it." You
There's
know,
an obvious answer
Yeah,
implied
yeah.
in
You're
that.
it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Destroy it. And then he turns the tables on them and says, "It's you guys. It's
Yeah.
the nation of Israel."
Right.
So that's how this paliso starts.
Yeah.
It ends with a song of thanksgiving.
Mm.
What's interesting is by the time it gets to chapter 12, God has worked his way through the judgments and stuff like that so that they can actually praise God for bringing a remnant through for them.
Right.
So in chapter 12, it just mentions a little thing. It says, "You were angry with us for a little while." And then he just starts praising God for delivering them and offering them salvation. So it's really interesting. Starts off with a real bad picture, ends with just an amazing psalm of praise.
So we've got a beginning and end
Yep.
related.
Yep.
Sounds like we're getting into something kind of like a chiasm.
Okay, good.
And so this would be a palistrophe would be something like a form of a chiasm.
Yeah,
Is that kind of what to
I-
describe it?
I sometimes say it's an extended chiasm.
Okay.
Only there's one more thing. There's something usually in the middle that these things balance around, which that's not in a chiasm usually.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's I guess you'd say it's a more specific kind of
Yeah.
chiasm or figure of
It
speech.
uses some of the pieces. It's
Uh-huh.
relating things. There's a kind of parallelism that's reversed,
Yeah,
right? As they
exactly,
move
that
towards the
part.
middle.
Yeah.
So that part's like a chiasm. But what makes it different is typically it's longer. Obviously
Yeah.
this covers like 7 chapters,
Yeah, that's
right? I mean,
right,
that's
yeah.
very long.
Yeah.
And then there's like a high point in the middle.
Yep.
That's really what everything is leading towards. It's all about the middle.
Yeah.
A chiasm is more about either the ends or could be how those two things in the middle
Relate or
relate to each other. But
Yeah.
in this way, a palistrophe is always about the middle.
Yeah, I
It's
think so.
leading towards something in the center.
Let's jump to that middle for a minute.
Let's do that.
Verses, if you look at it as chapter 1 through 7, and basically what you've got there is that's sometimes called the Isaianic memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because almost all of it is in first person, which
Okay.
is really rare in the book. There's only a couple other places where first person even occurs. Probably 5 altogether.
Yeah.
But that's rare to have a whole section that's in first person. Now, it is interesting. Chapter 7 is actually back to third person. But if you remember, we talked about Isaiah being a scribe
Right.
and that he pretty much wrote about Chronicles tells us he wrote about the events of Uzziah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking that chapter 7 is that Isaiah had already written about the Syro-Ephraimite War in his history. And so he took that, and in this stuff that's almost all first person, he just stuck that in because he had already written it. So it's by him anyway. And so I think that's how come you've got this third person
In the center of
section
that.
right in the middle of there.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing is, do you remember in chapter 6 is Isaiah's call?
Oh, sure.
So
Yeah.
it starts with his call and commission. He then goes to these 2 signs that are there. And then it ends in chapter 9 with this great thing about this Messiah coming. So what I understand is that Isaiah is going to be the one that gets them from the Song of the Vineyard to the Song of Thanksgiving. His main job is to tell them that they need to repent and they've got to obey God. And so it seems like to me, that's why that's highlighted. It's Isaiah's job to do his best to try to tell him that. Now,
Right.
God even lets him know it's not going to work, but your job is to do it. And so he's pretty much telling them the message, even though they rebel against it and all that.
Right.
So I think when I found this, I realized that the songs on the end make a lot of sense. They're balancing. And then I've got 6 woe oracles in chapter 5. They're matched by one big oracle in chapter 10 and 11.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's uplifted hand oracles. There's one in chapter 5, 24 through 30. And then there's 4 uplifted hand oracles in chapter 9, 8 through 10, 4. Now, what's interesting, uplifted hand oracles, they only occur in Isaiah, as far as I can tell. There are a few phrases in Isaiah that are similar to this, but these are definitely they're a unique kind of oracle
Right.
where God has already punished them to some extent, but because they didn't get it, his hand is still lifted up. So, and it means it's coming down in more punishment.
Right.
So it seems like because those are such unique things. Now, some of the commentators argue that these were together at some point. Now they've got split. Well, that doesn't, in my mind, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense
Right.
unless you've got a structure that was intended to do that.
Right.
So when I found that you had the matching parts on both sides, I thought, oh, that actually helps me to know, especially when those uplifted hand oracles are so rare and don't occur anywhere else in the Bible that I can tell.
So, how did you go about discovering this? Was it seeing
Yeah.
the ends, the Song of the Vineyard and Song of Thanksgiving? Is that kind of what clued you in that maybe there's something going on, or did you start in the middle?
No, I think I started at the end, but then I realized uplifted hand oracles, and then I looked
That's the
and,
thing
and
that-
found some war oracles on both sides, and I
Right.
thought, or woe oracles on both sides, and I thought, wow, that is an interesting structure.
Yeah.
And it seemed really clear to me.
Yeah.
So
So, I'm making a bit of a guess here, but in this case, it seems like the second half would be a lot longer than the first half of this palistrophe. Is that true, A? And then, like, if it is, the palistrophes, are they more dependent on ideas being kind of reflected to each other?
I also think you got to see key words, like uplifted
Okay.
hand oracle was pretty
Yeah,
clear
yeah.
in both of those.
So there's a phrase in there that's going to
Yeah.
be kind of specific.
Or your woe. Each one of those begins with a woe.
Mm-hmm.
So those are pretty clear woe oracles too.
I'm just wondering, because this is going to be harder for a person to find,
Yeah.
for sure. This is
Yeah.
that's a big chunk of
Yeah.
scripture to read. And of course, there's a lot of resources out there to help people find this stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
so that exists, but I feel like that could be tough when we're thinking of this kind of right now as the middle,
Right.
as kind of being the most important part, but it's obviously a lot closer. If you were just reading verse by verse, it would be closer to the beginning
Yeah.
than the end. So it's really more about these terms and the ideas. That's where you're getting the balance and the
I think
palistrophe
so.
from.
Yeah. And you're right. I think you've got to look for them, or I don't think they'll automatically pop up.
Yeah.
Although, why did you go to chapter 1? Because this one, this one is spread over 7 chapters,
Yeah.
like you said. But in chapter 1, you've got this one over about 6 verses. Okay? So
Okay.
if you go to chapter 1, verse 21 through 26, and this one I think is pretty clear. Look how it starts. How the faithful city has become a harlot. She who was full of justice, righteousness once lodged in her, but now murders. So it starts off that you had this faithful city, and now look at her. She's corrupt. Okay? Okay, your silver has become dross, your drink diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels, companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan, nor the widow's plea come before them. Okay, you can see that's definitely getting worse and worse
Yeah.
and worse. Okay, now look at verse 24. Therefore, the Lord God of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, declares, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenged of my foes. That's taking. That's basically summarizing who the people are that love a bribe and the widow's plea doesn't come before them. I will turn my hand against them, and I will smelt away your dross, as with lie. There it
Right,
is.
the silver.
We had that
Yeah.
in verse 22. I will remove all your alloy. Then I will restore your judges as the first and your counselors as at the beginning. That's kind of matching verse 21.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you will be called a city of righteousness, a faithful city. So
Right.
now you've got the matching
Righteousness is
terms.
back, yeah.
Yeah, the faithful city there. So it seems like to me that one is easier to spot because you've got within a couple verses all the things that are reversing, and you have those exact words that have. And once again, if that's true, then verse 24, when God stands up to judge,
Yeah.
it makes some sense.
That's the
Yeah, that's
the
that
key.
center.
Yeah. Right. Right. That's
So-
a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, so there you have it in a lot smaller area, so it's easier to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's pretty clear because of the matching terms.
Yeah. And really, if you're looking for a chiasm, this would be something would probably stick out to you as well.
Yeah, I think
But
this
there's
one
that
is fine.
central section. That's really what you'd have to know. Or maybe if you're really paying attention, you would figure out is that there's the important thing you need to walk away with understanding in this passage is that God stands up and declares it, and that's when things change.
Now, one interesting thing is that chiasm kind of summarizes the whole book again.
Oh, sure. It's that same kind of model.
You start out with this wicked. Well, this one started out as a righteous nation, but then or city. But then it says, but it got corrupt. God's then going to step in and bring restoration, and that's what the whole book's about. So that chiasm actually fits really well.
And I think, smelting away dross, that's inferring a remnant, a piece that's left, I would imagine, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. So this palistrophe, I think, is pretty clear.
Yeah, that's a good one. And that's Isaiah 1,
Yeah.
let's see, 21
Verse
to
21.
26?
Yep.
26?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, what's our next literary technique here?
Oh, we're out.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's all of them. There's a lot more in Isaiah.
Yeah, I'm
These
sure
are
there
key
are.
ones we need to know
Yeah.
as we go through it. These are terms that'll probably come up a lot as we're discussing it.
Here, I've got this PowerPoint here to show you that faithful city. I call it a faithful city palistrophe.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's perfect. That's good.
And then actually, I did start on the date. So I started to talk about the date of the book, the message. And that's actually going to be really important because chapter 1 kind of, remember I told you that verses 8 and 9 highlight that idea of Jerusalem being destroyed, Judah being destroyed, but the city is standing up like a like a hut in a
in the vineyard. Yeah.
Or there's actually it's two terms real similar. One's in a cucumber field.
Cucumbers,
and one's in
that's what it was. Yeah.
But the date of the book actually helps you. So chapter 1, I actually think is dated to about 701.
Mm-hmm.
That means it's not the earliest thing in the book. That's why I put this here. Isaiah said, a lot of times the prophets start with an introduction that gives when it was being written to, and who was the kings at the time a lot of times. And so this one actually helps us. So you've got Uzziah, who's dated from about let's just do 792 to 739, somewhere in that time frame. So that means if you go to chapter 6, it says, in the year of King Uzziah's death.
Okay.
So let's say 740 round number. Okay, so now you know that probably there wasn't much that Isaiah had in the biblical text that's about Uzziah's time, because that chapter 6 is basically his call is probably like one of the first things in his life was his call.
Oh, sure, right.
So that would make sense. So if that was about the first time, then if you go to chapters Isaiah 37 through 38, because that would actually is probably the last thing that's in Isaiah's lifetime. I'm going to start at verse 36 because that'll give you the context. Then the angel of the Lord went and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. See, we now know that's 701, okay? So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And it came about, as he was worshiping in the house of his God, in his rock his God, that Adramelech and Sherazar his sons killed him with a sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon his son became king in his place. Now we know that Esarhaddon started at 681. So if that's the last thing that Isaiah would have lived in, okay, and known about probably, then that means from about 740 to 681 is like Isaiah's time frame.
Okay.
That's actually quite long. So that's basically 60 years.
Yeah.
Most prophets don't prophesy that long.
Right.
Daniel is one of the ones that does seem to prophesy for that long, but Isaiah's got an awful long time that he's prophesying. And if that's let's say he's got 60 years of prophesying. Let's say he doesn't even start till he's probably 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to make him an old man by the time he's done.
Yeah.
So that gives us some dates now to help put in perspective what chapter 1 is about, but then his call comes in chapter 6. That's kind of odd that his call doesn't come until chapter 6. You'd expect it much earlier.
So
it doesn't because of the structure, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. So this is probably a structural reason.
I think so.
Right. We may think of it probably like in a more modern Western. We kind of want things in order.
Yeah.
We like to start at the
Yeah.
and just kind of go through chronologically. Yeah. Why do you think it's set up this way?
Yeah. My understanding is that there's 2 sections before chapter 6 comes around. One is the introduction. That one's pretty clear, and it gives the basically the message of what's going to happen to Israel. They're going to be judged, and God's going to deliver them. Okay? Then you go through chapters 2 through 4, and it's got a totally different structure, but it says the same message again, only with more detail. Then you get to chapter 6, and you've got actually chapter 5, if you remember, is the song, right? And then you've got that whole palistrophe thing that's going to go over it again. So I think what's happening is that these if a person's reading that, knowing that structure, they realize that it's just going over again and again the message that God has. You're in sin now. You're going to be punished, but good news is God's going to restore you. And you hear that message 3 times before you get to chapter 5.
So do you think I would be overstating it if I said one thing we can learn from that is that the theme here is maybe even more important than like
who does it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this is something that's like really key. You have to know.
Yeah.
That would kind of make sense as it gets passed down to like further generations, I think, right? I mean, like this is the most important thing you need to know out of this writing.
Yeah. And I think that if it goes over it like 3 times, you'd probably start getting it.
Right.
So I think that's what the author's doing. And especially if every once in a while you put these palistrophes in there that highlight that theme one more time.
Yeah.
So I would think by the time you get to chapter 5, you've already been over this 3 and 4 times. You should be getting it.
Yeah. So really all these literary techniques are just re-emphasizing, maybe not in every example, but in a lot of ways, they're re-emphasizing theme, main point of this book, main point of Isaiah's prophecy.
Yeah. You saw that surely in the palistrophes. That was a given, right?
Yeah.
Even the chiasm kind of did that because you were talking about there's going to be a positive time, but in between the time is they're going to be destroyed. So you got that in the chiasm, at least the one we looked at. Plays on words are to catch your attention so that even more. And there, if you remember, he called out for righteousness. He got bloodshed.
Right.
So
there's an opposites kind of there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
and then highlights it even more with that Hebrew parallelism. So you're saying one thing, then you're saying it again. You're saying another thing, you're saying it again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that's really interesting. We may want to get even deeper into the time, maybe in a future episode. I think there could be a lot more to pick out of that, but I kind of like how that relates back to the overall structure of this book as we kind of go through it.
And as we go through the book, I'll try to highlight those dates and help see how it fits together.
They'll get set in.
Yeah.
Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a good episode. I think there's a lot for people to chew on. Do you have any recommendations for other resources people can access to learn more about literary techniques? What's the best place for a person who wants to know more about this to go?
I would say commentaries should be able to spot these. Not every commentary will highlight these kind of things. There are other, maybe the easiest way is to maybe go into a book that actually talks about literary structures or literary technique, and just see especially if it's in Isaiah. I think I've seen a book called Literary Technique in Isaiah.
Oh.
And I know there's a book on wisdom in Isaiah, wisdom elements in Isaiah.
Okay.
So there's a lot of times things like that. And I also know of another book that does like tree images or family images or things like that they highlight a theme that might also help us get some of these.
Find some of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I think your best bet, maybe if you could just now know that these are things that you'd be looking for.
Yeah.
And if I always sometimes go on the internet just to find information
yeah.
about what does it mean, and then where do you find them? And sometimes they'll have some examples, maybe in Isaiah.
I think some of these, probably about half, maybe a little more than half of these, you should be able to recognize in English,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe it's just kind of reading a little slower,
Yeah.
kind of trying to don't take the step too fast of trying to figure out what this means. Just look at the text, look for those kind of patterns and stuff. Maybe take some notes. That'd probably go a long way.
And maybe another book that would be really helpful. There's one by Watson on Hebrew poetry,
Okay.
and that one would be real helpful to see how does that parallelism work. And it's sometimes quite complicated, but I think that if you could catch the main parts of it, you ought to be able to spot that.
Yeah, you get pretty far probably.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's really good. Well, next week, or next time we meet, let's.
Can I just highlight one more time that idea of the history? If you know the history, the book makes a lot more sense. And so maybe kind of what I did in my commentary was to try to highlight some of the major times, like the Syro-Ephraimite War. What happened then? 701. What happened then? 586. What happened then? So if you know kind of the big structure, some of these things will make a lot more sense how they fit into it and stuff like that. So I think that might be your best thing is to get a little history under your belt and then start understanding, when are these things happening? Because if you know that in the year of King Uzziah's death, and that's actually Uzziah was actually a pretty good king, but at the end of his life, he went into the temple and sacrificed. Like a sacrifice, made a sacrifice he wasn't supposed to, and he got leprosy. So if you knew that, and then so here the human king just got something really bad happen to him, and now Isaiah sent to that time period.
Right.
So that really, so here's in the year that King Uzziah died, God sends Isaiah. So it would actually help you to understand the history some too. So
that's
why,
not just a historical statement. That's telling you something very specific, because they all know how Uzziah ended. Yeah. I think that'd be helpful. That'd be a great thing to have. Maybe we can connect some historical context right into this.
We'll
to give a little bit of and we'll do that, I think, as we go through. Too, as we continue to go through, we'll have good reminders for that. That's really good. I think that'll be very helpful.
Good.
Okay, that's good. Well, thank you again for your time, and thank you to all of our listeners, and be sure to join us next time as we study Isaiah.